Chapter 4, Glassware and Other Breakable Items. So May's dead. Don't know how, but yeah, she's carked it. Now with great sorrow, Isobel packs her books, which are to be stored at Aunt Noeline's. However, this sorrow of being apart from her books is accompanied also by the recognition that her evil heart is rejoicing in the prospect of freedom that has come with the death of her mother. Now Isobel approaches Margaret, who is weeping in the bedroom. This causes Isobel to be overcome by a paralyzing sorrow, not at her mother's death, but at being unable to grieve at it. So what Isobel is concerned about here is not necessarily her mother's passing, but rather her own inability to mourn. At the funeral, this is no different. She is unable to feel anything for her mother. Now arrangements are made for the girls. Aunt Yvonne wants to take both the girls in, but Isobel reveals that she has a job interview the next day, which is a translator for German mail. Now because of this, Isobel will find a place to board, and Margaret will be taken in by Aunt Yvonne. Now Isobel is dropped off at a boarding house by Yvonne and Margaret. Isobel and Margaret exchange a short goodbye, and then Isobel approaches the boarding house, her new home. This is the last time that we see Margaret. Now Isobel is welcomed by the landlady, Mrs. Bowers, who gives her a quick rundown of expected etiquette. Isobel also meets Mrs. Prendergast, who is one of Mrs. Bowers' friends, and then starts to get settled into her room and unpacks. Now eventually, Isobel regards herself in the mirror and notes how the likeness to her mother, which seemed to her usually to be a curse from birth, seemed unimportant. After all, a face was only a glove. It didn't have to be clenched in rage. Now at first, this seems positive because she's dissociating from her mother. But then she takes it a bit too far when she imagines changing her name to Maeve Callahan. Poised, serene, quietly self-confident. You know that fragmentation of identity stuff we were talking about a little earlier? The identity crisis? Yeah, that's not going anywhere anytime soon. Now the dinner bell sounds and Isobel goes to dinner where she meets the other boarders, the most notable of which is the younger of the two girls, who is Mrs. Bowers' daughter, Madge. Now there are 4 other boarders, an old woman called Betty, an old man called Mr. Watkin, and 2 young gents, Tim and Norman. Now after dinner, Betty gives Isobel a full tour of the building, and Isobel begins to idolize Betty, wanting Betty to tell her the most important thing, how to be like her. Now Isobel is then left to unpack, and although Isobel wants nothing more than to spend the night reading, she decides that appropriate etiquette demands that she engage with her fellow boarders. She does this by watching the boys play cards. Now the next day, Isobel is off to work at the office of Lingard Brothers Importers, where she meets Olive, who I'm pretty sure is the receptionist, who escorts her to their boss, Mr. Walter. Now he explains to Isobel her several duties, the most pertinent of which is translating German mail. Now Olive returns and sets Isobel up at a typewriter, and then Isobel also meets 2 other employees, Rita and Nell, and then her work begins. Now in her first letter to translate, Isobel reads about a Mr. Verosik, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, and he is a glass manufacturer in Czechoslovakia, and in his letter he laments about his shipments being delayed. Now after translating the letter, Isobel asks for some assistance with the typewriter since she doesn't know how to type. Rita helps her out and demonstrates how to use the typewriter, but this only makes Isobel feel incompetent. As she starts to type out the German letter in English, she thinks that she felt closer to Mr. Verosik than to anyone nearby, which should come as no surprise since to her, Mr. Verosik is nothing more than letters on a page, and as we know from Isobel's love of reading, that is generally how she understands the world. Now because she's so slow at typing though, there is another man, Mr. Richard, who stands behind Isobel and watches her impatiently. Now Isobel remarks that the keys are oddly arranged, and this seems to offend him, so much so that he leaves. Now it's here that Isobel thinks that she carries about an invisible knife, wounding people without being aware of it. Now later on, Mr. Richard returns and continues to watch Isobel, and she calms herself by pretending that she is in Czechoslovakia with Mr. Verosik. Now as soon as she finishes the page, Mr. Richard takes it, and Isobel moves on to the next letter. Now in her next letter, Isobel encounters some German words with which she is not very familiar, and this prompts her to go in search for a German dictionary during her lunch break. However, due to the little amount of money she has, she decides that the money that was intended for lunch, that will be used for the dictionary. and she will also go for a walk at lunch so nobody near. Now, I don't imagine anyone would have an issue with that, but remember, in Isobel's youth, she was conditioned to be ashamed of poverty. And so this is just another example of how her mother's influence is still very real. She even goes on to characterize poverty as a fault of nature which must be concealed. I wonder where she learned that. Now anyway, Isobel finds a bilingual dictionary in a discount pile at a secondhand bookstore, and it's so battered that the seller lets her take it for free. She returns to work and she gets quicker at typing and translating, but the helicopter supervision of Mr. Richard still bothers her a little bit. And to compose herself again, she thinks of being in Czechoslovakia with Mr. Vorosik. She gets home that night, exhausted, and she heads to bed without any reading time. No reading time! Now, over the next couple of days, Isobel gets faster at typing. She also befriends a storeman at work, Frank, who unpacks glassware. Now, I only bring this up because glassware is in the title of the chapter, so I feel like this moment is important. Now, basically, Frank describes Mr. Richard as a suffering soul, because if he were to unpack the glassware himself, he would take his anger out on them and break them, which would also cost him money. Now, Isobel asks Frank if he's a suffering soul, to which he responds, some can wear it, some can't. Now, this little scene is potentially really important because it addresses the issue of suffering, or more specifically, the way in which people respond to or wear their suffering. Now, it begs the question, is Isobel someone who can wear her own suffering? Now, make of that analogy what you will. There are a few ways that you could interpret that. Now, Isobel visits Aunt Noeline, who works out a budget for Isobel and gives her financial support. She even pays for Isobel's tuition for business college, a whole term's worth anyway. Now, Isobel is grateful, but at the same time, this makes her feel like a burden. Now, Noeline assures her that the financial support is only until Isobel can support herself, which will happen when she gets a raise at work. Now, Isobel dreads the idea of asking for a raise, but Aunt Noeline imparts a life lesson on Isobel, which is when she says, you will get nothing out of this world unless you fight for it. Similarly, Noeline admits that she thinks Isobel is not a fighter, and that she could consider alternate employment. Now, Isobel is reluctant, and Noeline suggests that Isobel just give it the year before thinking about it again. Now, Noeline is then called on a phone where she speaks presumably about some kind of betting or gambling, which prompts Isobel to think of how people spoke poetry. Now, by this, she means that people speak to each other in a way that she is not familiar with, or more specifically, a way in which she is not herself capable, which fills her with a longing and a sense of exile. Now, this is important because this will be a point of comparison when she meets the special crowd a little later. Now, Isobel returns to work where she is still bothered by Mr. Richard's monitoring. Frank advises Isobel that there are two ways of taking this. The first of which is inner calm, which is essentially just ignoring him and not letting him get to her, and this is not unlike the grace that Isobel attempted to maintain back in chapter 3. Now, the second way is to actually express her frustration, even if it means politely apologizing to Mr. Richard for how slow she is on the typewriter, or even saying, bitch, back the hell up out of my space. Now, obviously, he doesn't actually say that, but that's kind of the gist of it. Isobel, true to form, she goes with the former, that is, the inner calm. And to an extent, this seems to work for her. Now, at home, Isobel starts to settle in a bit more. She notices how Betty doesn't come home for dinner some nights, allegedly working late, and on these nights, the boys, Tim and Norman, are particularly noisy, which disrupts Isobel's reading. Now, she also notices how Madge is always disappearing, not that we know much about what she is doing at this point anyway, and Mr. Watkin, the old fellow, he seems to be scrapbooking. Now, on one particular night, while Isobel is reading, Norman throws a paper ball at her. Now, it seems, arguably, that he is flirting with her, which makes Isobel a little excited, but also kind of ashamed at how easy she is. Now, Norman does the same thing several nights later, and Isobel jokes that the ball of paper is actually a love letter in code. Now, she does this as a way of trying to participate in the games young people played, but Norman denies that it's a love letter, and Betty is also skeptic. And so this makes Isobel return to her reading. Now, from then on, Isobel sticks to her reading every night until one night, Isobel is rearranging herself under a light to better read her book, Norman calls out that she should be careful because she'll ruin her eyes, because apparently guys don't go for chicks who wear glasses, which is ridiculous because glasses are hella sexy. Anyway, Isobel corrects his grammar, which I think she means well, but this seems to offend him. Now, this is the second time that Isobel thinks about the invisible knife that she seems to carry about, wounding people or offending people without knowing it, because she doesn't understand that social etiquette. And that's because she's such an introverted creature who historically only gets her understanding of the world through literature. Now, similarly, Isobel begins to feel that the entire boarding house has afforded her no sympathy whatsoever, even Betty, and this might presumably because she, at one point or another, offended them all in a similar and oblivious way. Now, who knows? All we know is that for the most part, she's been keeping to herself, just reading, and she also feels that no one likes her. And if it's because of her reading, then tough luck, because people who wanted her to give up reading were asking too much without offering anything in return. Right behavior didn't work unless everyone practiced it. So that's kind of depressing. Isobel does find comfort in at least knowing where she stands, though. Now, Isobel thus retreats to the kitchen with Mrs. Bowers and Mrs. Prendergast and listens to their conversation. Now, Mrs. Prendergast, Isobel describes as an admirer of death, while Mrs. Bowers is the enemy of sex and marriage. Now, as Isobel listens to their stories, it is said of Isobel that her mind contains a cold collector intent on information at all costs, or a collector of useless objects. Now, in this way, she is collecting information or experiences, but through stories, because again, presumably, that is how she understands the world around her. Now, later on in typing class, which Aunt Noeline paid for, Isobel laments about how miserable it is. She describes the conditions to be like dehumanizing solitude and a reasonable representation of hell, where she's surrounded by other damned souls. And the only reason she stays is because Aunt Noeline paid for it. Now, back at the boarding house, Mrs. Bowers tells Isobel about her daughter Madge, whose vice is like a strange religion. Now, all we know about this vice is that she apparently sits with a group of people saying papa and staring at candles. Now, while Mrs. Bowers doesn't approve of this, she says that at least it's better than the other thing, capital O, capital T, probably referring to sex, since she's the enemy of sex and marriage. Now, Mrs. Bowers also tells of how Betty is involved in a divorce and how Mr. Watkins spends his time documenting racehorses. Now, all of this information prompts Isobel as she tried on each life to see how it would suit her. So again, that notion of dissociating from herself, finding escapism in pretending to be someone else, that sense of identity, that's still not very strong here. Now, Isobel decides she likes Mr. Watkins' life the most, since it comprises mostly of privacy and routine. Now, Isobel enjoys business college, if only because it gives her the opportunity to eat out and read without anyone bothering her. She also comments that on Saturdays, it seemed easy to live happily, and this is due to finishing work early, visiting the library, eating out, reading out, coming home to collect more stories from Mrs. Bowers and Mrs. Prendergast, who Isobel describes as the two fates, and then finally ending with her reading alone in her room. And yes, if you didn't notice, this listing sounds like a routine that contains a lot of privacy, not unlike Mr. Watkins' life, which Isobel just previously decided was the most appealing among her fellow boarders. Now, at work, it is revealed that Rita is getting married, and as such, she is possessed by a beautiful absurdity. Now, Isobel is unsure of how to respond to this news. She's left wondering what to say, but settles for admiring the ring, and even that seems like an odd thing to do. Now, this is important because it will be a point of comparison later on. Now, what this highlights is Isobel's social incompetence. Even in a social experience where someone is getting engaged, you would think that it'd be pretty easy to figure out what to say, like, congratulations, best wishes, blah, blah, blah. But the fact that Isobel struggles with this or doesn't know how to respond, it illustrates how she's not a social creature. And again, this is perhaps because her preference is always to be in a book rather than physically engaging with those around her. Now, due to this marriage, though, Rita is planning to relocate with her husband in Melbourne, meaning her job will be left vacant. And Isobel acknowledges that this is the promotion, or this is the opportunity for a raise that Aunt Noeline said she should ask for. But Isobel is reluctant because she's become comfortable with her new life, and she doesn't want anything to change. She remarks, "This was life. No sooner had you built yourself a little raft and felt secure Then it came to pieces under you and you were swimming again. Ah, the struggle is real! Now, shortly after this, Olive takes Isobel aside and she warns her that it's not quite right to be so familiar with Frank, the store man with which Isobel has become friends. And this is mostly because Frank is apparently a communist. Now, Olive also explains that Isobel could indeed have Rita's job, but her attitude needs to improve. And this comment is in relation to the way that Isobel sometimes makes fun of Mr. Richard. Isobel then has a chat with Frank, who asks her what she wants out of life, and he suggests being a writer. Now, instead, Isobel says, "I want to be one of the crowd." Now, this is really important because for the majority of the text, we know that Isobel has actively been seeking her solitude and her privacy, mostly to read in peace. And so it's interesting here that she openly acknowledges what she really wants, which is to fit in, to belong, and to connect with people. Now, Frank laughs at this, and he suggests that if Isobel is interested in communism, he'd be obliged to tell her about it outside of work. 2 weeks later, this is the appearance of the special crowd. Now, Isobel is at a cafe on Glebe Road, so let's just call it the Glebe Road Cafe, and she is reading peacefully when she perceives a group of about a half dozen people. Now, the group discusses literature, and one of the boys recites a poem that Isobel construes to be offensive to Byron, who is one of Isobel's favorite authors. Now, this is juxtaposed, however, by a sense of amazement that Isobel feels at hearing verse spoken aloud as if it was part of the conversation. Now, Isobel continues to listen to them as they exchange thoughts on writing, which prompts Isobel to think that that was living as she longed to know it. Now, there is also mention of a person called Joseph, which seems to be the lecturer or the tutor for the group, and the more he is spoken of, the more Isobel becomes jealous, because this Joseph character is a loved, respected authority, at least when it comes to literature, which is obviously something that Isobel has never had herself. Now, it is also revealed that the boy that recited the poem, his name is Kenneth. And Isobel also recognizes one of the girls from school, Vinnie Winters. Now, this prompts Isobel to approach the group, but specifically to approach Vinnie since that's her way in. And yes, this is buckets of crazy because Isobel's never done anything like this before. So it's a pretty important step for her socially. Now, Isobel introduces herself and she says that Vinnie was in the same year as Margaret. Vinnie doesn't seem all that impressed by this though, but another boy, Trevor, he immediately invites Isobel to sit with them, and he even collects Isobel's things for her. Now, Kenneth asks Isobel if she were a part of speech, which part of speech would she be? And it is here that all the members of the group are introduced. Now, Kenneth is a transitive verb, Jeanette is a coordinating junction, Vinnie is an adjective, Trevor is an abstract noun, Nick is an adverb, Diana is a past participle, there's also a dude called Mitch, but he leaves pretty early, so we're not sure about him, and Isobel decides that she is a preposition, which is basically a word that expresses a relationship between two other words or two objects, like with, or for, or on, or from, or to, or by, etc., etc. Now, Isobel makes the joke that her landlady is also a preposition, against, and this elicits laughter from the group, which also elicits Isobel's observation that making them laugh made her acceptable. Now, obviously, all of these parts of speech, they are representative of the fact that every word in a sentence serves a particular purpose. Every word has a specific function and has a reason to be there. And as such, likening oneself or people in general to parts of speech would imply that people also serve specific functions in groups or in society as a whole. Now, as a preposition, Isobel thinks that she is someone who expresses relationships between other things, ideas, or people. That is her function. Now, interestingly, and this is my reading of this particular concept, but interestingly, if we consider the title of the novel, which is I for Isobel, then in that title, in that phrase, the preposition is the word for, which expresses the relationship between the I and the Isobel. Now, it's almost as if the I and the Isobel are dual identities, or two identities that Isobel is trying to reconcile throughout the course of the book. She is caught between them, and there's that fragmentation or that division of identity that I've brought up a couple times now. And because Isobel is caught between those two identities, she characterizes herself as the preposition, the for in the I for Isobel, because that word in the title, that preposition, is literally between the two identities of I and Isobel. She expresses that relationship between those two identities. In fact, over the course of your reading, you might have noticed that there are certain instances where the perspective shifts in the narrative between first person and third person. There are times when the third person narrator, for just a moment, seems to have a voice of her own. An early example of this is in chapter 1, when May, Isobel's mother, is asked point blank how old Isobel is. And this is, of course, on her 9th birthday. Now, Isobel was conflicted about whether or not her mother remembered her birthday, but when May is asked this question, the narrator makes a comment. She says, oh, how do you like that, Mrs. Callahan? Now, this is extremely subtle and extremely important because this line, this thought, it does not actually belong to Isobel, but it belongs to the narrator. It belongs to the first person perspective. It belongs to the I, not the Isobel. So even on that sentence level throughout the text, there is that subtle divide between the narrator and Isobel, the first person and the third person, the two identities, which is where I personally think the meaning is in the way that Isobel thinks of herself as a preposition, because she is between those two identities. Now, I'm not sure if all of that made sense. Again, that was just my reading of the situation. You could, of course, interpret that in other ways. I think I'm just going to move past that for now. Anyway, when Isobel leaves the special crowd, she does so entranced, full of wonder, since she has finally met people that seem to speak her own language. Now, when she returns to the boarding house, she reveals that Isobel, the born liar, was back. And this is because she lies to Mrs. Bowers about her whereabouts, saying that she had lunch with a friend, Emma, who is not real and who Isobel made up. And this lie was born from the perception that a taste for solitude was something to be hidden. As you can see, there is a pattern here regarding elements of Isobel's life and identity that she thinks needs to be hidden, which isn't healthy. Now anyway, this mention of Emma makes Mrs. Prendergast remember an Emma who went crazy, and after bearing her third child, apparently she greased the baby up and put it in the oven because she's crazy. The kid was okay, but yeah, it was pretty weird. The only reason I bring that up is because, again, it's something that comes up a little later. Ooh, now Isobel tries to find the special crowd once again, and she does this by looking for books by the poets that the crowd was discussing, and by going back to the same cafe. Now during this time, Isobel also conjures up her own version of Joseph, which she describes as tall, understanding, severe, and loving. And she compares this to the real Joseph, which obviously she has never met, but whom she pictures to be a little whimsical man, plump and spry, with a bald skull and wisps of fair hair, essentially making him as unattractive as possible out of sheer jealousy. Now what this reveals is that Isobel is still very much keeping intact that old habit of inventing imaginary acquaintances during times of comparatively profound solitude. Now remember, Joseph is the lecturer or the tutor of the special crowd, which is something for which Isobel yearns but has never had. And so this fabricated Joseph of hers is a means of filling that gap in her life. Joseph is another fireball, so to speak. Now the special crowd enters the cafe and Isobel is invited over, and she struggles to gain their approval. But she attempts this by trying to make them laugh. Now during her first encounter with the special crowd, if you remember, Isobel noted that making them laugh made her acceptable. And similarly, this time she notes that she must entertain, she must be a success. Now she also tells them of Madge and her religious sect, the way that she sits down with people and says pam pa, and the boys, Trevor and Kenneth, they actually reveal that it's part of a Buddhist mantra, which they say in its completion. And in its completion, it means the jewel is in the lotus. The individual is enshrined in the universal. Okay, have fun figuring that one out. Now after this, Isobel continues to look in the public library for other writers discussed by the special crowd, and at the same time she still enjoys her routine Saturdays and lied without conscience to Mrs. Bowers. And this causes Isobel to feel really alive and morally bad as ever, which is interesting since there's that association between feeling alive and being morally bad. In bed that night, Isobel has a discussion with her imaginary version of Joseph, because you know, that's normal. The conversation that she has though is quite interesting and insightful. She begins with the thought, suppose one is bad, not by choice, and then she goes on to question the nature of goodness. Why can't one choose to be different, she wonders. And she even links this question to her attempts in the past to change. She says, I thought I could make my life a room and choose what came into it. But ultimately she comes to the realization that life isn't like that. It's more like swimming in a sea with currents and undertows carrying you where you don't want to go. And these currents and these undertows are mysterious evil passions, such as rage and envy, most of all an unconquerable sadness. Now she relates this to how she feels around the special crowd, because while they seem to accept her, she knows that she is never to be truly one of them. Ah, po ba ba. Now Isobel also laments about her jealousy not only for Kenneth because he has the real Joseph, but also apparently Madge. Now after learning that Umpampa was part of a Buddhist mantra, Isobel thinks that she might be jealous because she knew something I didn't know, referring to Madge. But ultimately this causes her to engage in examinations of conscience. That is to reflect on herself, particularly how she always thought that she was a born liar, which also made her seek out the deathbed repentance because she didn't believe that there was a way to change herself. Now again, this highlights that conditioning from her mother and that low self-esteem that Isobel has. But the reason Isobel believed she was so bad was because of her lying, and the fact that she couldn't distinguish between lies and the truth, and as such, that was a sin. Now Isobel's greatest sin, as we know, has been her compulsive lying, not necessarily to others, but to herself with these pieces of fiction, these fabricated acquaintances like Joseph. Now when she finishes up for the night, she calls Joseph, my love Joseph. So yeah, that's not weird at all. At the boarding house, Madge announces her engagement to a dude called Arthur. Now this is important because this is a point of comparison with an earlier moment in the book. If you remember, when Rita announced her engagement at work, Isobel was unsure of how to respond. This time though, with Madge's engagement, Isobel actually says, I like your ring, as well as admiring the ring, which was something she saw the girls do the first time. Look at that, Isobel is learning. This is shadowed, however, by a bit of jealousy. It's noted that she never disliked Madge more than when she was doing the very thing Isobel would have done in her place. So there's an element of envy here. Isobel sees a bit of herself in Madge, but more importantly, she sees that Madge has opportunities that Isobel herself doesn't. Perhaps in Madge, Isobel sees a better version of herself. Now later on, Isobel listens to Mrs. Bowers, Madge's mother, complain about the engagement, calling Arthur a religious crackpot. Now this is not the only thing that Isobel does not enjoy. Again, she feels that everyone else in the boarding house, with the exception of Mr. Watkin, is hostile towards her, exhibiting the very kind of bitchery that she most detests, which she complains about to Joseph. Now she summarizes her concern quite succinctly when she says, "This is when I worry, when people dislike me and I don't know why." Now we all know that predicating oneself on the approval and validation of others, it doesn't always work out very well, and it's not very healthy. But again, you could attribute this to how Isobel never had her mother's approval, which may have prompted her desperation to find it elsewhere, or anywhere, really. Back at the cafe with the special crowd, a girl named Diana shows up, and it's obvious that she is a source of tension among the group. Now Trevor gets up and leaves with Diana. It is conjectured that Diana is trying to annoy Nick. Why, you might ask? Because apparently Diana was obsessed with Nick and ruined his previous relationship with another girl. Now this causes Isobel to recognize the ability to turn oneself into a weapon, which is something that incites a keen thrill in her. That's not a red flag at all. But this does link in with that concept of carrying about the invisible knife. The fact that Isobel is, in a way, fantasizing about hurting others, it demonstrates that her mental health is not very great. Because there's that part of her that wants to hurt, that wants to abuse, and that's the part of her that's like her mother. Now the group then goes to 51, which is where Nick and Trevor live, but it belongs to a woman called Helen. Now Kenneth, Jeanette, and Helen discuss Diana, whom Isobel thinks is like a corpse before you died, presumably because of the obsession from which she suffers. Now when Trevor returns, he invites Isobel to look at his books in his bedroom. Wink, wink. Now this makes Isobel nervous, but she agrees. He lends her a copy of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which, if you're the reading type, is a mad book, so check it out. But anyway, Isobel realizes how late it is and rushes home. When she returns for dinner, she once again feels the stab of fear that she had done something to offend, because apparently no one is overjoyed to see her. Now, she laments about how much she wished to know where she went wrong. So maybe, just maybe, it's because there is that part of her that's like her mother, offending people or hurting people with that invisible knife, intentionally or otherwise. Either way, depends on your interpretation. Now, Mrs. Bowers starts to become irritated and focuses on the engagement between Madge and Arthur, particularly her disapproval of Arthur and the disappointment that she has in Madge. Now, over dinner, Mrs. Bowers implies that Arthur is a freeloader, which causes Madge to confront her mother, and at this moment, Isobel develops a newfound respect and admiration for Madge, thinking, if I could ever have done that, and that obviously referring to standing up to one's mother. Now, it comes out more explicitly here when Isobel thinks to herself, you didn't hate Madge for her methodical mastication, which was a habit that Madge had, that Isobel noticed, whereby she chews her food like 32 times before she swallows. You hated her because you took her place. Now, this potentially means that, similar to the way in which Isobel perceives Madge to be a better version of herself, if that is indeed your interpretation, then so too did she hate Madge because Isobel took her place as Mrs. Bowers' favored child. Now, Isobel characterizes this as a hammer blow of enlightenment, and she learns that seeing took time. Meaning that coming to this realization and developing this perspective, it took time. And she also acknowledges now that being the favored child is not aiming very high. While her admiration of Madge grows, so too does her opinion of Mrs. Bowers deteriorate. Madge leaves, and this is described as an uplifting little miracle that puts all the boarders in a good mood. Now, another really important point here is that this is the first time that there is mention of the idiot in the attic, which is a personification of Isobel's suppressed inner thoughts. Now, this is the moment Isobel becomes aware of it. This is arguably the thing that she has been wanting to know her entire life, the thing that's been making it so difficult to discern between truth and lies. Now, consider this particular extract. The idiot played its games with the real world, and what was worse, it played them behind Isobel's back. Not anymore, now that she knew. Could she do this? Watch a part of herself and control it. Fight against it all her life. Now, this is where Isobel learns what's wrong with her. It's because of this idiot in the attic, this part of her that confuses her sense of fantasy and reality. Now, it's because of that that others don't like her. At least, that is how Isobel sees it. And it's because idiot wants a mother. Idiot can't have one. Life is very difficult. So again, the idiot in the attic, it's that suppressed part of herself, the part that she's keeping bottled up. The same part of her that comes out in those little bursts when she wants to hurt people, or when she offends them, thus pushing them away. Now, this links back to the idea of that fragmentation of identity, the two halves, so to speak. One half being Isobel, the other half being the idiot in the attic. Now, when Isobel is helping Madge pack up and leave, so too does she become afraid of Mrs. Bowers' response. But the dual identity is highlighted perfectly here in the line, Isobel was afraid. No, not Isobel, but the idiot was afraid of meeting Mrs. Bowers. So I've said before that this idiot in the attic, it's a personification of Isobel's inner thoughts. It confuses her sense of reality and fantasy. Ultimately, all things considered, I think that the idiot in the attic is a personification of all of Isobel's doubts and insecurities, that manic part of herself that is destructive and self-destructive. Now, as the narrator rightly notes, the idiot shared her body and had a hold to it. And this is the conflict with which Isobel struggles throughout the course of the novel. Now she's just become aware of that struggle. Now, just as a side note, it's also been said by other analysts that the idiot in the attic is an allusion to a character in the novel Jane Eyre. Now, being the voracious reader she is, it wouldn't come as a surprise that this would be Isobel's justification for using that term, but basically in Jane Eyre, there is a character called Bertha who was considered mad and thus locked in the attic and shut away from the world. And this is used as a symbol of feminine oppression, which links to Isobel because, again, those thoughts and those insecurities, those manic doubts that she has, Isobel oppresses those. She shuts them away. And so they're very much like the proverbial idiot in the attic. Now, that's what she calls those thoughts when they come up again. Now, back at the cafe, Isobel is with Trevor, Jeanette, and Mitch. Now, the boys are working on writing. Isobel then goes to 51 to borrow another book from Trevor's room. Looking at the books, she describes it as the best hours of childhood. Now, shortly after, Helen appears to tell Isobel that Diana is at the door, and she asks Isobel to get Diana to leave and pretend that no one else is home. Now, Isobel approaches Diana, who comes inside, and even though she knows that everyone's avoiding her, she says of herself that she is a curse and a bore, so she doesn't blame them. Now, Diana then starts to cry about seeing Nick because apparently to her it's life or death to see him. She confesses about stalking Nick and his ex-girlfriend, being obsessed, and how it's made her lose her job. Now, it's also a bit more explicit here that Diana was also one of Nick's exes, which is probably why the obsession started. Now, Isobel is fixated on the fact that Diana doesn't have a job and can't support herself financially. This is something that is crazy insane to Isobel because, again, this is probably because of the way that she was raised to perceive money. But Diana doesn't really care. Because of how much Isobel seems to be asking about what Diana will do with money, though, the narrator comments that here was someone feeble enough to bring out the bully in Isobel. Which again, even that line, it doesn't come from Isobel herself, but the narrator. The narrator is giving a bit of commentary here. Anyway, Diana says that she doesn't care about anything because she's as good as dead, which also links back to Isobel thinking of her as a corpse. Now, in response to this, Isobel describes life in general as a perpetual state of change and development. She says, life must always be changing, and so, if you had a life without change, it might be as good as death. God damn it, Isobel, be careful what you say to depressed people. Anyway, this seems to incense Diana, which prompts Isobel to note that masochists prefer to devise their own sufferings. Now, this is a hella good observation. Isobel says it in relation to Diana because Diana obviously wants to feel sorry for herself, and when Isobel tries to express sympathy, that pisses Diana off because she's a masochist. She wants to be responsible for her own suffering. She doesn't need others to create it for her. Now, the reason this is super interesting is because Isobel herself could be called a masochist, someone who devises her own suffering. Everything that causes Isobel suffering can be tied back to her own decisions, her own behavior. Her mother was the cause of her suffering at first, true, but her mother died. Did that stop Isobel's suffering? No, it didn't. Isobel chose to read books. She chose to be antisocial. She chose to create these pieces of fiction, these fireballs in her mind like Joseph. No one forces her to do those things, and yet those are the things that make her suffer the most, make her feel like she was born bad, because this alienates her from others. And it doesn't just alienate her from others, but it alienates her from herself as well. These decisions perpetuate that fragmentation of identity that she experiences. These decisions is why she is described as a preposition, because she is trapped between these two identities, between these two worlds that she can't reconcile. The I and the Isobel, the idiot and the Isobel, the truth and the lie. This dualism is what's key here, and Isobel's only now just starting to become aware of it. Anyway, Isobel goes with Diana to the bus stop, where Diana asks Isobel to come home with her. Weird, right? Isobel denies the request. She just wants to get stuck into another book. When she returns home, however, and she starts to read, she is haunted by the thought of Diana and second guesses her rejection of Diana's invitation. Selfish and heartless Isobel. Again, that is a comment from the narrator, not so much Isobel herself. Ultimately, Isobel sticks to reading though. Later that night, she is haunted again by Diana, and specifically what she said to Diana, which was pretty much that she was as good as dead. Now, she second guesses whether or not she actually said this, but then she decides that yes, it was possible since the idiot in the attic is a spiteful little bastard. Now, Isobel momentarily becomes panicked, thinking that Diana is suicidal, and her words to Diana may contribute to any self-harm or suicide attempts that Diana makes. Now, as a result, Isobel vows to never speak without thinking again. Now, meanwhile, with Madge gone, Isobel feels that she has become the new object of Mrs. Bowers' anger. But even so, Isobel says it's much easier than going out into a strange world again. Now, Isobel's back at the cafe again discussing the boys' writing, then back at 51 with Trevor. Now, at this time, Trevor makes a move on Isobel. He puts an arm around her, and instinctively, she pushes him away. Back the hell up, biatch! Now, Trevor apologizes for this, but Isobel takes off, and in that moment, she knows it's all over. It was all gone in a second. The cafe, the books, the conversations. Jeez, she's such a drama queen. But anyway, the more pressing detail is that somewhere along the line, she had likened Trevor to her Joseph. Trevor was Joseph. She had lost them both. Now basically what this shows us is that Isobel is not ready to indulge in the prospect of being Trevor's girlfriend, because it would mean pretending, being like a spy in a foreign country, having to pass for a native. Now that analogy obviously expresses how unfamiliar Isobel is in the territory of committed relationships, and if she were to pretend, she thinks that she would eventually be found out and inevitably she would end up like Diana, walking and watching, obsessed with suffering. So she cuts her losses and she runs. Now Isobel stops going to the cafe and she laments about what she's lost and how things might have been different, but ultimately she seems resigned to her fate. Apparently, she was what she was, and nothing could change her. Not with that attitude. Now, at work, Isobel receives a call from Helen, who informs her that Nick is dead. He died in an accident on his bike. Now, Helen asks Isobel to tell Diana, and to keep her from interfering when Nick's mother shows up to pick up his belongings. Now, reluctantly, Isobel agrees. She admits she would rather be the one to comfort Trevor. However, it is noted that you built a wall around yourself and too late you found yourself walled in, which nicely captures that image of being trapped by your own efforts to protect yourself. Now, Isobel made the decision to cut ties, and now, look at that, she's trapped by that decision, by the weight of her sadness. Another example of Isobel being a masochist, willingly or otherwise, causing her own suffering. Now, Isobel is released from work early and she visits Diana at her home. She tells Diana that Nick is dead, but this doesn't rouse the reaction that Isobel was expecting. In fact, Isobel identifies the calm and muted response of Diana to be one of relief. Isobel was the prison governor who had brought her news of her reprieve. Now, if we remember, Isobel felt rejoice at the prospect of freedom in the wake of her mother's death, which was paralleled by a sadness from not being able to grieve the death and feel something. And Isobel seems to perceive this in Diana's response. Now the similarity here is that Isobel was obsessed with her mother, May, in the same way that Diana was obsessed with Nick. Now both their lives revolved around someone else. Even their response to the deaths is similar in that once the object of their obsession was gone, which for Isobel was her mother, and for Diana it was Nick, they felt a sense of relief. Isobel, however, does not become conscious of this, but she has an inkling. She doesn't know why it matters to her how Diana responds to the news, just that it did matter very much, though she did not know why. Well, that's why I think it matters. She had an idea that watching Diana respond to death contained within it some insight about how she responded to death herself. There is a parallel there. Now, Isobel returns to 51, after which Nick's mother, Mrs. Drummond, shows up to collect his belongings. Now, Isobel and Helen listen from downstairs as Mrs. Drummond wails and screams and goes through bouts of silence in her grief. Now, Isobel and Helen give the lady meds from her own purse, then they put her to bed. Trevor returns, and then Isobel leaves. Now, Isobel returns to the boarding house where she informs Mrs. Bowers that she is moving out. Mrs. Bowers doesn't seem to care. In fact, she says good riddance, and this makes Isobel cry. Now, this is interesting because it's not necessarily due to her relationship with Mrs. Bowers specifically that Isobel is crying, but more so that even after all this time, Isobel still hasn't managed to maintain any meaningful relationships. She rightly says you could change your name, have your face altered, change your country and your language, but in the end, you would resurrect yourself. Ultimately, though, she is happy to leave. She packs several of her books, and she reads a passage by Auden, who is one of the poets she was introduced to through the special crowd. The passage reads, "It's no use turning nasty, it's no use turning good. You're what you are, and nothing you do will get you out of the wood." So that mirrors Isobel's sentiment pretty accurately. There's no sense trying to pretend or change, because you are what you are and nothing can change that, apparently. The final line of the chapter reads, "One is never quite alone." But this implicit companionship is in reference to her books, not actual people. So in terms of personal growth here, yeah, it's still not great. Ugh, that was a long chapter. One more to go. Almost there.